28 years later might be the worst thing happened to this franchise. Previous film at least had one of the greatest opening introductions in zombie movie history ever. But this new one, ah. The fate of Spike is unclear. The mystery around Cillian Murphy's Jimmy is such a waste. And the supposed cure for the infection raises even more questions than the virus itself. What went wrong? Let's discuss If I Hook You. Finally. To understand why 28 years later feels so strange, we need to go back to the film that actually made this franchise possible. 28 Days Later. Because that film wasn't about the infection, it was about something far more fundamental. And somehow, 28 years later completely lost it. The reason why 28 Days Later worked so well is because it was never about the zombies. It was about people. Ordinary people trying to survive in a world that has already collapsed. The infection was terrifying, yes, but the real tension came from something else. Loneliness, grief, and the quiet fear that humanity itself might not survive this new world. But in 28 years later, that focus shifts almost entirely onto Spike. A kid who can barely even shoot a zombie with an arrow, and the adults around him has to make up for his mistakes. And because the story revolves so heavily around him, the survival aspect, the very thing that defined the original film, takes a backseat and fades into background. But here's the strange part, because 28 years later isn't a terrible film. In many ways, it's completely opposite to the original film, that is 28 Days Later. 28 Days Later was chaotic, grainy and documentary-like. But this one, 28 years later, is clean, beautiful and mythic in scale. And for the first time in the franchise, the film actually becomes curious about the infected themselves. How did they survive for nearly 3 decades? And why is there an alpha among the infected? And somehow a pregnant infected gives birth to a completely healthy baby. These are the fascinating ideas that the original never even tried to explore. And the sequel, 28 Years Bone Temple, doubles down on them, even hinting at something that the franchise has never dared before. A possible cure. From a technical standpoint, this duology is incredibly ambitious, which makes the real problem even more confusing. Because the original film was never about heroes. 28 Days Later worked because it followed the ordinary people, confused, terrified, barely surviving individuals. The story wasn't building towards a grand myth or a chosen protagonist. It was simply about humans trying not to collapse when the world already had. But 28 years later takes a very different approach. Instead of focusing on the fragile human survival, the entire story leans onto one character, Spike. And the film spends most of its time spending something bigger, something that quite never arrives. Because the story is clearly trying to build towards the next chapter, 28 years later, Bone Temple, which was heavily marketed on the possible return of Cillian Murphy's character, Jimmy. But the strange part is, even that setup never fully lands. And that's because the film spent most of its time building towards mythology and philosophy. That actual survival story almost disappears. At its core, the message of 28 years later is very simply, everyone must die. The film constantly circles around that idea, but the strange part is how it tells that story. Instead of creating tension through the survival, the narrative follows Spike taking his mother to the mainland to find Iron, a strange figure who spends his most of the time sedating an alpha with morphine. On paper, that journey should feel terrifying. Two humans traveling through the world full of infected. But somehow it rarely does. The film seems to be far more interested in the symbolism and the philosophy rather than in the raw survival tension that defined the original 28 Days Later. And by the time the film ends, it almost feels like the story was only half told. Which is exactly where the sequel, 28 years later, Bone Temple, steps in, trying to repair the damage because strangely, the sequel understands the franchise far better than the film that set it up. 28 years later finally completes the story, and the biggest change is Spike. In the first part, Spike mostly drifts through the world, but here he grows, he makes choices, he faces the consequences, and he feels more of a character rather than just a vehicle for the plot. The metaphors are still there too, but this time they serve the story instead of replacing it. The old Nick group. Their leader isn't exactly someone you're supposed to admire, but he is written so well that you can't help being fascinated by him. He brings something that the previous film lacked: human tension. And on the other side of the world, something even stranger is happening: an alpha. At first, they're just monsters, but slowly the film suggests something else. An alpha wearing cloth, not literally cloth, basically a piece of cloth, but trusting iron and behaving something like civilized, which raises a terrifying possibility. What if the infected aren't just decaying? What if the infected are evolving? And yet, even while resolving many problems of the first film, the story leaves us with new questions. Because the future of this franchise clearly isn't Spike alone. It's the one character the entire duology circles back to: Cillian Murphy's Jimmy. And if the hints are correct, the next chapter might change the entire direction of the series. And that brings us to the biggest mystery of the franchise: Jimmy. Cillian Murphy's character has been looming over this entire duology, yet we still don't know where he is or what kind of world he's walking into. Because things are changing. There's a completely new civilization near the mainland, and there might even be a cure. Ian already experimented with treating the infection, realized that the rage virus is mostly hemorrhage, psychosis, and uncontrollable aggression. And somehow it worked. The alpha calmed down, the rage disappeared. Even more shocking, a bite didn't seem to turn him back, which raises terrifying possibilities. What about the pregnant woman on the mainland that Spike couldn't kill? What happens if the virus can mutate or even be controlled? And the biggest of all, is Iron really going to die? These are the mysteries that the future films have to answer. But if you want to understand how this franchise worked in the first place and why the original still stands as one of the greatest zombie films ever made, check out my breakdown of 28 Days Later. You might see the entire franchise differently after that. Thanks for watching. This is Visio, and see you in that video. The narrative follows Spike's